In a video released on December 22nd last year, I shared with you my analysis of Vietnam's North-South high-speed rail project. On December 17th, Vietnamese authorities released a photo with great fanfare. Germany's Siemens signed a so-called Century Cooperation Agreement with Vietnam's largest private conglomerate, Vingroup. Vietnam's richest man, Pham Nhat Vuong, shook hands tightly with Michael Peter, CEO of Siemens Mobility, and announced an investment of $67 billion to build Vietnam's north-south high-speed rail line. As early as 2006, Vietnam had already proposed an ambitious plan for a north-south high-speed railway. But the problem was obvious. The total estimated investment reached $67 billion. While Vietnam's entire annual fiscal revenue at the time was only $16.7 billion, the project had no choice but to be shelved. Now, after nearly 20 years of planning, Vietnam's high-speed rail dream finally seemed about to come true. Soon after, all major Vietnamese media outlets simultaneously published the news. The official press releases were practically one step away from printing the words "National Rise" directly on the front page. At that moment, the entire country was electrified. Vietnam's Minister of Transport could hardly wait to announce in Parliament, "The high-speed rail will soon connect the entire country. This will be a milestone in Vietnam's industrial development." But Vietnamese excitement wasn't just about getting high-speed rail. More importantly, German technology had officially defeated Chinese standards. In their eyes, this was the perfect success of a strategy known as using foreigners to counter China. The message was clear. Without China, Vietnam can still achieve industrial rise. But no one expected that just as the country was celebrating. On December 25th, Vietnam's richest man, Pham Nhat Vuong, suddenly changed his mind. Ignoring a stock price crash and losing $1.9 billion in a single day, he urgently announced Vingroup was withdrawing its investment from the North-South high-speed rail project. From celebration to collapse, it took only 8 days. Vietnam hadn't even woken up from its euphoria before plunging straight into an ice bath. Why did Pham Nhat Vuong and Vingroup suddenly turn their backs? The reason is actually very simple. One sentence sums it up. The Vietnamese government wanted something for nothing. Although Vingroup is Vietnam's largest private enterprise, it has expanded aggressively in recent years and already carries a high debt ratio. Asking it to directly shoulder $67 billion was simply impossible. So they approached Vietnam's Ministry of Finance and the central bank with a so-called 20+80 plan. Vingroup would provide 20% of the funds itself. The remaining 80% of $53.6 billion would be guaranteed by the Ministry of Finance, with the central bank providing 35-year, zero-interest loans. But unexpectedly, the proposal was jointly rejected by both the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. The reason was explicit. Vietnam's government could not accept privatized profits and nationalized risks. The central bank even issued a public warning. This would create systemic financial risks. National credit cannot be used to pay for corporate investments. The Ministry of Finance also made its position clear. Although high-speed rail is a national strategic project, the government will not use national credit to guarantee corporate investment. Enterprises must bear their own profits and losses. When Vingroup ran the numbers, the problem became obvious. Once completed, the railway was expected to generate $5.6 billion in annual revenue, but operating costs alone would reach $4 billion per year. Their 20% share, $13.4 billion, was manageable. The real issue was the remaining $53.6 billion. If the government had provided 35-year, zero-interest loans, annual repayments would have been only $1.53 billion, barely manageable. But now no government guarantee, no zero-interest loans. That changed everything. Vietnam's central bank policy rate stands at 4.5% to 5.0%. Even preferential loans for major infrastructure no lower than 4.0%. At 4.0% interest, borrowing $53.6 billion for 35 years means equal principal and interest, $2.872 billion per year, $46.92 billion in total interest. Equal principal, $3.647 billion in the first year, $1.565 billion in the final year, $37.609 billion in total interest. Either option means a long-term, crushing burden. On average, nearly $3 billion in repayments every year, with over $1 billion just in interest. Who could possibly endure that? And this doesn't even include equipment depreciation, replacement costs, or the risk of additional investment during construction. So the result was simple. The government put in no money. Private firms carried all the risk. Yet the social benefits of high-speed rail had nothing to do with the private investors. Tell me, isn't that a deal doomed to fail? So Pham Nhat Vuong chose to endure a short-term stock collapse and reputational damage, rather than fall into a bottomless pit where the more you invest, the more you lose. In just 8 days, the so-called Vietnamese Century Project, once hailed as the hope of national rise, collapsed in complete chaos. How did it come to this? In today's video, I'm going to dig into Vietnam's dark history of infrastructure projects. And it's not just high-speed rail. When Vietnam built its first light rail line and its first metro, the outcome was just as disastrous. Vietnam's first light rail line was the Hanoi-Cat Linh Ha Dong line. It was built by China Railway 6th Group. Construction officially began in October 2011, and the line opened in November 2021, with a total length of just 13 kilometers. At this point, you're probably stunned. A 13-kilometer light rail line, built by the so-called infrastructure maniacs, took 10 full years. What happened? Once you understand the details, you'll realize backwardness doesn't happen without reason. In fact, it wasn't just a high-speed rail project. When Vietnam built its first light rail line and first metro line, the scenes were just as chaotic. Vietnam's first light rail project was the Cat Linh Ha Dong line in Hanoi. This line was built by China Railway 6th Group. Construction officially began in October 2011, and it wasn't put into operation until November 2021. The entire line is only 13 kilometers long. At this point, you might be shocked. A light rail line of just 13 kilometers took 10 full years to complete. How is that even possible? Once you understand what really happened behind the scenes, you'll realize something very simple. Backwardness is never without reason. At the beginning, we were actually full of confidence. China Railway 6th Group has extensive experience. Forget 13 kilometers, even 130 kilometers wouldn't have been a problem. So in October 2011, construction officially began. But almost immediately, we ran into a massive obstacle. After transporting heavy machinery and equipment from China to the site, we discovered something unbelievable. The Hanoi municipal government did not even completed land acquisition. We waited and waited. It took for full years bare the land was finally secured. Alright, land acquired, now we can build, right? Not yet. If you work on infrastructure, you know permits are unavoidable. Land use, traffic, sanitation, environmental protection, fire safety, public security, labor regulations. And on top of that, coordination with local wards and communes. Problems everywhere. Someone was always showing up to make things difficult. So we went to the Vietnamese government. After all, we weren't here to develop real estate or sell apartments. We were building a light rail system to improve Hanoi's traffic. A government-approved public infrastructure project. Couldn't they help streamline things a bit? The Vietnamese government shrugged and said, This is none of our business. Don't follow the procedures. So we ran around endlessly, dealing with paperwork. Eventually, everything was finally sorted out. Surely construction could begin now. Sorry, still no. In 2014, Vietnam started stirring up trouble in the South China Sea. On May 2, 2014, China's Haiyang Shu 981 drilling platform began exploratory operations in waters adjacent to the Shisha Islands. Vietnam responded by deploying a large number of vessels, including armed ships, to forcibly interfere with Chinese operations, ramming Chinese government vessels performing escort and security duties. Vietnam even sent underwater diverse sabotage operations, deploying fishing nets and floating obstacles. By June 7th, Vietnamese vessels had surged to 63 ships at peak, with 1,416 incidents of intrusion and collision against Chinese vessels. At the same time, large-scale riots broke out inside Vietnam, targeting Chinese and Taiwanese companies. Factories were smashed, looted, and burned. 2 Chinese nationals were killed, and economic losses reached billions of Vietnamese dong. Later that year, on November 26th, another collision incident occurred between Chinese and Vietnamese vessels near the Shisha Islands. Under Vietnamese media hype, a wave of anti-China sentiment swept across the country. Chinese companies were heavily impacted, and naturally, the light rail project being built by China Railway 6th Group was no exception. Vietnamese authorities didn't care that we were helping them build public transportation. They didn't care about long-term benefits to Hanoi or to Vietnamese society. They only cared about one thing: you are a Chinese company. So they kept finding excuses, using every possible method to obstruct construction. Even under such hostile conditions, by 2018, we had completed the light rail. Then came the obvious question: if construction was finished in 2018, why did operations only start in 2021? The answer is simple: the client refused to pay. The Vietnamese government delayed payment and refused to organize project acceptance. China Railway 6th Group not only didn't receive payment, but was also forced to advance $100 million out of pocket. No payment means no handover, so the project dragged on for another 3 years. Finally, on November 6, 2021, the line officially opened. 10 years. 10 full years for just 13 kilometers of light rail. If this were in China, we would have built several complete lines already. At that point, China Railway 6th Group was utterly exhausted and finally understood. This is why Vietnam had 0 light rail lines for so many years. Backwardness really does have its reasons. So by 2012, just 1 year after the light rail project began, Vietnam decided to build its first metro line. By then, we had learned our lesson. There was no way we were beating again. So this opportunity fell into Japanese hands. The Japanese were actually quite happy. A year earlier, they had lost the light rail project to China and felt deeply resentful. This time, they believed they had finally won through sheer capability. They were wrong. Very quickly, they discovered they were facing the exact same problems. Originally, Vietnam planned to invest 17.4 trillion Vietnamese dong and complete the project in 5 years. But due to planning issues, permit problems, and extremely complex construction conditions, the project was delayed again and again. 5 years passed, inflation rose, costs skyrocketed. The budget ballooned to 28 trillion Vietnamese dong. The original approval was only for 17 trillion. What now? They had no choice but to submit the project to Parliament again for reapproval. And once Parliament got involved, everything stalled indefinitely. As funds dried up and construction risked stopping, Ho Chi Minh City had to dip into its own budget, scraping together 3.3 trillion dong to pay contractors and workers. Then they went to the Japanese contractors and painted a beautiful picture. You fund construction for now. Once Parliament approves the money, we'll pay you immediately. They even promised, if Line 1 goes well, Line 2 will be yours too. And unbelievably, the Japanese believed them. They continued advancing funds. And thus began the scene. Promises may last forever, payment never arrives. The more the Japanese companies paid up front, the longer Vietnam delayed. Eventually, even the Japanese ambassador to Vietnam, Kunio Omeda, and Japan's vice foreign minister, Toshiko Abe, personally urged Vietnam to pay. Why are you here, Mr. Dot Ambassador? To collect the debt, please pay. Sounds surreal, doesn't it? Vietnam eventually paid part of the money. Then COVID hit, and suddenly, they had a brand new excuse to delay again. By 2023, one of the contractors, Hitachi, finally lost patience and filed for arbitration. The reason? Long-term delays had drastically increased costs. Hitachi demanded to 4 billion yen in compensation, about 1.13 billion RMB. Vietnam refused to acknowledge responsibility. The tug-of-war continued. Finally, on December 22, 2024, Ho Chi Minh City Metro Line 1 officially entered operation. Vietnam's first metro line, one light rail line 10 years. One metro line 12 years. Now tell me, does a country like this really deserve to build high-speed rail? At this point, you might be wondering, if Vietnam is like this, why did they approach Germany's Siemens for high-speed rail? Now you understand. China and Japan have already learned their lessons. They're done. Vietnam lacks industrial foundations, capital, and technology, yet wants all the benefits without bearing any risk. Always trying to get something for nothing. Who would want to take such a project? That's why this time, Germany only provided technical support. The actual investment was supposed to come from Vietnamese private enterprises. They thought these would avoid the old problems. They were wrong. The Vietnamese government reverted to its old habits. High-speed rail is a national strategic project, but the state would not guarantee enterprise investment. Companies must bear their own profits and losses. So the private company walked away. The billionaire accepted a $1.9 billion loss. Anything was better than falling into a bottomless pit of losses. From celebration to collapse, Vietnam's so-called national rise lasted just 8 days before completely evaporating. After months of official hype, this entire saga turned into a global laughingstock.